And coming to the second part of the landscape ecology, that is the components of scale. Okay, scale here is a very, very important entity that plays an important role in determining the outcomes of the observations related to that land. Hutchinson has called the ecological theatre. They are played out on various scales of space and time. Scales, we will study that there are temporal scales as well as spatial scales, that is somehow related to the lifespan of the organisms present in that area, or what is the distance between these habitats, or what can be the movement range of a particular organism. On the basis of that, the scales are decided. So Hutchinson said that ecological theatre, they are played out on various scales of space and time, and to understand these dramas we must view them on appropriate scale, that depending upon that particular landscape and what is the purpose of study, the scale should be decided. There is no single natural scale for all kind of the landscape. We have to vary it according to our interest, according to our criteria or the observations that we want to collect from that land. So there is no natural scale available. It is a variable one. We can have spatial scales as well as temporal scales while studying a landscape. Now, what is the temporal scale? It is the habitat lifespan relative to the generation time of the organism. For example, let's suppose in a particular landscape we have two habitats. There will be number of habitats. We are taking example of two only. So habitat 1 and habitat 2. These are the number of individuals in that particular habitat, and these are with A dash and all. Few species, they are common, few are different, that is in habitat 2. Now, when we have to find out the temporal scale for studying this landscape, then we should know landscape lifespan. Let's suppose this landscape, this habitat is going to persist for 100 years. Then we have to see the generation time of the organisms in that area. Let's suppose the generalized generation time is 50 years. So let's suppose this is an average value that organisms survive for 50 years in this habitat and the habitat stays for 100 years. Then its temporal scale will be 100 upon 50. So that will come out to be 2. More is the population in a particular area, the overall value of the temporal scale increases. Second is spatial scale. Spatial scale is the space between the habitats. So let's suppose habitat 1 and 2, they are at a distance of small d, and we can also observe the movement limits or the dispersal distance of these species which are present in that area. Now it will vary. For example, I can say that species A can move up to 10 kilometers only. Species F can move up to 100 kilometers. So depending upon species, the dispersal distance will vary. Now, how we find out spatial scale, that is the distance between these two habitats, so that an individual from here can move here or vice versa, divided by the dispersal distance of the organism. For example, let's suppose for an organism this is 10 kilometers. So this overall comes out to be 0.005, and this is inversely proportional to the population size. So more is the population size, lesser will be the spatial scale. Now, depending upon these scales, they are selected according to the landscape. Then we have different components of the spatial scale. Two important ones that are mentioned here, that is grain and extent. Grain, what is grain? This is a finest unit of management. So, in a particular stand, the minimum spatial resolution is called grain. And so this is a minimum mapping unit, just like as you prepare your graph papers and you have a scale set and there is a smaller scale for that particular division. So similarly, this a grain is just equivalent to that in a landscape ecology term. So here this is a minimum mapping unit, and grain is the size of the individual units of observations. That is the smallest entities that can be distinguished. For example, a fine-grained map might structure information into 1 hectare unit, whereas a map with an order of magnitude coarser resolution, that will have its size as 10 hectare units. So now that depends upon you. If it is a fine grain, the scale will be of smaller level, But if it is a coarse grained, the scale will be of larger level. Second comes extent. Extent is the scope or domain of the data. That is defined as the size of the study area, means in which you are going to carry out your activity or you are going to collect your observations. That overall range, that will be called extent. So extent is simply the spatial domain over which the system is studied and for which the data is available. For example, the overall area encompassed by an investigation or the area included within the landscape boundary, that will become your extent when you go to a particular landscape. So that is extent, and the minimal smallest unit that will be considered while taking the data, that smallest unit is mapping unit, is called grain. So you can have an example here. What happens when we increase the grain size? For example, let's suppose this is a one picture you can see here. These are small areas. They are 1 meter square sized. And if I increase the scale, if I increase the grain value to 4, then you will observe lesser number of patches. So this is a fine grained and this one is a coarse grained. Second is if you increase the size of the extent. Now extent means you are increasing the size of the landscape or area under consideration for collecting observations. So this is the one in which we are having again here the grain size. The scale selected is 1 meter square. So the area is divided into small polygonal compartments of 1 meter square. Now here the extent is just 16 meter squares. Here I have increased the extent to 81 meters square. Here it is 400 meters square. So overall area under consideration is expanding. So this is what happens when you increase the size of the extent, and this is the overall area remains same. However, the scale changes. So here the scale you have taken n is equals to 1. Here you have taken n is equals to 4 meters. So accordingly the number of the grains they will reduce. So it will be having more grains. So fine grain, this will be the coarse grained. So that was all regarding the scales and grain or extent. Now coming to what is the importance of scales whenever you are deciding scale of for a particular landscape, how it is going to affect that the observations and the data collection in that area. So first is with change of the scale, a system may change from open to a closed system. For example, let's suppose a closed system is when there is no exchange of the energy or no organisms are moving from that. An open system is when the population is migrating, it can immigrate or it can emigrate. So that will become an open system. For example, let's suppose here when I consider a small scale, then this local patch, you can see these are small areas, these are the local patches. So if I have selected this complete island as the scale, then this is an open system, right? This is a closed system because the organism cannot move from this island to any other place. This is an island, solitary island. So if the scale is larger up to the island level, then this will behave as a closed system. However, if I am taking the small areas under consideration so that the extent is lesser and the scale is smaller, then they can move from one place to another. So there can be immigration or emigration in these local patches. Then this behaves as an open system. So this depends upon your observations, what kind of observations you want to have. Accordingly, the scale can increase or decrease and a system can behave as a closed or an open system. Now, changing scale can also change statistical relationship of the landscape communities. For example, you can see here, we have here the local scale is 4 hectares plot. So when you observe the relationship between a least flycatcher and American redstart, then you can see that when we have a local scale in a particular area, in a small area, we observe that there are just 4 hectare plots. Then we observe a inverse relationship. So a place where redstart is more, flycatcher is lesser and so on. But when we have a big landscape, so when the size is increased, then you see that overall in a huge landscape area, they have a positive relationship. American redstart and flycatcher, their concentration is mutually dependent and they go on increasing. There is a direct relationship. So we can have different kind of the associations observed as the scale changes. Then to describe the spatial correlation and pattern in the data. Okay, in an effort to better understand the structure of the system, scale is very, very important. To choose an optimal experimental design, one of the key principles of experimental design is the independence of the units. This is very important. Whatever experimental units you have, they should be considered as independent entities. So this is necessary so that we can be certain that the measured responses to the treatments is due exclusively to the treatment themselves, and there is no interaction between those experimental units. Now, to interpolate data and construct contour maps, scales are required. So, oftentimes we have sparsely sampled data and we want to predict the values for the unsampled location. For example, it is a huge landscape and you cannot collect data from all the areas. So, you are just having sparse sample data, and on the basis of that information you want to predict the values for the whole of the location. So this is called interpolation, and there also you need the scale. A proper scale is to be fixed first. So there the major goal is to model the spatial dependencies in the same sampled continuous data and use this model. So it is always based upon a model making. For example, you have information about this part or this part, you want to extrapolate it for the whole of the data, and on that basis in the small area you will first prepare a model. There are different softwares to design these models, and then it can be predicted for whole of that location from where you have not collected the samples. Now, how these patterns are measured from the landscape, for this we have different websites are available, like we have GIS, the Geographic Information Services. This is a government link. You can click this link and observe the information. Another is the data types. Here we can either have the aerial photography, there can be digital remote sensing, you can have the airborne imaging scanners, published data can also be referred, and census can also be used, or there can be ground survey of the vegetation. So this is how the patterns they can be measured in landscapes. Now, various techniques which are used in landscape ecology, we use different instruments like computer is required. This is must for having this kind of the study. Then GIS and large database is required. Broad scale field studies should be informed. Spatial data, different model making, simulation facility. So these are all required when we are interpolating that data. Okay, now coming to the scaling techniques. First is point patterns. Point patterns here we observe, let's suppose in a particular area you want to have a point corresponding to a particular type of the ecosystem. Here we are giving example of vernal pool. Vernal pool are the types of temporary wetlands which develop in the Mediterranean regions, and they are purely temporary because ultimately when the season changes then it is going to convert into a hard land mass, but otherwise most of the time they remain as the wetland systems. So when we observe their pattern, the correlation, then we see that around 1.7 kilometer there is a clustered pool pattern. You can see here this is corresponding to 1.7 kilometer, and here we observe that all of these curves they are meeting at a place, so there is a clustered pool pattern. So whatever pools are developing, they are in close vicinity, they are developing in the clusters, but after 2 kilometers we observe that they are following separate curves, means now they are uniformly distributed and not clustered. So this is how the patterns they are observed and the data is correlated. Second is linear network. So either we can have point data as the observation, or we can have lines represented. That is called the linear network. You can see here in a particular area, in a town or the city, we can show different kind of the areas represented with the lines. Like here, this area, that is a large complex functional area, and the one which is light in color, those are the functional corridors. They are forming the green net, And this is a complex transfer and functional corridor. The light green one representing the corridor areas, and the dark green one, they are the main spaces where the activity is taking place. And then we have given the overall planning of that area. That dark gray color represents the old town center. Then there is inner city, and when we move towards the outer side, the light grays, they are the urban cells which have got high population density. So this is how in a particular geographical area, these are all interconnections you can see here, these are the corridor areas. So in a particular landscape, you can have the data presented in the form of linear networks. Then comes the continuous data. Continuous data is usually observed for the environment related factors. For example, let's suppose you are measuring rainfall in an area, the temperature calculation is there. So that is presented in the basis of the continuous data. So it is not discrete as point data. For example, you have map of a leaf area index. Okay, so leaf area index has been presented, or the elevation, just like the satellite images that you obtain from Google Maps. So elevations are also presented. So it is a continuous data. So here you can see that we are measuring up entity continuously across that landscape, and there are no explicit boundaries, they are missing. So patches, they are not delineated, we don't have any linear observations or lines for that. And here you can conceptualize this data in 3D format. So you can see here we have presented this data, and this is related to the leaf area index. You can also have same kind of the observations for temperature index, for rainfall index, and so on. Fourth category is categorical data. Categorical data, this is the one which is expressed in the form of patches. Now this is not grain, not a point one. This is on the basis of patches. So a mosaic of discrete patches, they are together presented for a landscape. And you use different colors for those patches. For example, this is related to land cover types. So you can see here a particular land, let's suppose it is a crop land. So this has been designated with this light green color and a symbol in that. Or there is one which is a forest area, that is dark green in color. Then non-forest wetland area, this is a non-forest wetland area. There is an open land that is represented by this fluorescent green color, so on. So different areas, patches, they are designated with different colors and patterns, and mosaic of these patches, that is presented as categorical data. So this is always in relation to a particular landscape when we are talking about its use, land use. So that was all the different types, how the data can be presented. Now coming to the size and the shape of the patch, how it is going to affect the biodiversity. Whether a patch is small in size or homogeneous in nature, and what is its overall shape, that is going to affect the type of species in that area. So what is a patch? Initially, a patch is defined as a relatively homogeneous area that differs from its surroundings. As you can see, this is a satellite image. You can clearly see this patch is different from the surrounding. Similarly, this patch is different from all these four adjoining this area. So you can clearly view that patch pattern is a particular pattern is observed in the satellite image, and each of that small area represents a patch. So it is relatively homogeneous and it differs from its surroundings. What are the characters of patches? Patches are the basic units of landscape that change and fluctuate, and this process is called patch dynamics. For example, let's suppose when you are observing this patch at some other period of the year, let's suppose autumn season, it may be a completely barren land, it is changing, right? Let's suppose this is a crop land and it is getting prepared for the crop, it is underflowing. Again, the structure will be different. So these, they keep on fluctuating, and all this phenomena, when we study this, what fluctuation or changes are coming across that patch, that is called patch dynamics. Patches have a definite shape and spatial configuration, and they can be described compositionally. Means I can count number of trees, number of species in that area, and they are not going to vary. A patch will remain of a fixed definite shape. Landscape patches, they have boundaries between them. which can be defined or fuzzy. So when we are moving up from one patch to another patch, the boundary may be a clear-cut boundary. As you can see, this is a tree line and this is a grassland. So you can observe a clear-cut boundary. So this is a defined boundary. But here you can see this is not a defined one. In between you have a wavy patch for the trees, and other ways there is a herbaceous community. So this is called an undefined boundary or a fuzzy boundary. So the boundaries between different patches, they may be defined or fuzzy. The spatial and temporal variation of the abundance of organisms that increase as the size elongates. So let's suppose a patch is of small size and then there is another of the elongated size. There is one which is even more elongated. As it is elongating, the abundance of organisms that also increases. Then the number of organisms in a patch would remain constant for all patch shapes, where the number of organisms in a patch was limited by the amount of resources. Now let's suppose I'm saying that the patch size is increasing, it is expanding, but the resources remain same. So if the resources are limited, then the number of organisms that will also remain constant. Then it is unrelated to the patch size. Then there are three states for a patch to exist. It can be a potential patch, an active patch, or a degraded patch. So the one which has got all the resources in it, so that species they are getting colonized in that area, that is called a potential patch. An active patch where the individuals are already sustaining and they are in a regular dynamics with the environment, means non-living and living components they are interacting. So this is an active patch. And degraded is, let's suppose the organisms from that area they moves at some other place because the resources they got depleted, then it will be called a degraded patch. Again, it can become potential patch after the recovery process, after it is abandoned for some period or with the human intervention, it can be reconverted. Then it will again become a potential patch and same process will continue. So a patch can exist either in potential, active or degraded form. Patches are linked. So although the patches they may be separated in space, that okay you have one patch, another patch, there is a gap between, they may be separated in space, but the migration can occur. The individuals they can move from one patch to another patch. This is how they are linked. And this migration maintains the population of some patches and can be mechanism by which some plant species they spread. Larger patches, they have higher population, so they have less likelihood of extinction. Whereas if there are smaller patches, they can be easily, their lifetime, their period of sustenance can be shorter as compared to the larger ones. Then continuous patches, they have higher core area. Let's suppose this is a continuous patch, so its core area will be larger as compared to the fragmented patches. So here the dark green colored core area, it has reduced. So it depends, but here the edge area will increase because now this is also counted under edge. So these which are unfragmented continuous patches, they have more core area, lesser edge area, whereas the fragmented patches have less core area and more edge area. Larger patches, they have more diversity of habitats as well as populations. So here you will observe different kind of habitats when the size increases, and accordingly the number of species will also increase. You can see here this is a larger patch having more biodiversity. This is a smaller patch. Then patches closer to a larger patch will be more likely to maintain their populations as compared to the one which are at a farther distance. Like this is a large patch, this is a small patch. Now there can be interaction between these, so the organisms can change their place. So there is more chances of persistence of this patch because it is closer to a larger patch. However, this one which is at a farther distance from this, that ultimately result in a kind of no interaction at all and can lead to the extinction. So the one which is farther from a larger patch is at a risk of extinction more as compared to the one which is closer to the larger patch. Then the portion of an ecosystem near its perimeter is called edge. You can see here the boundary areas, they are called edge. Now the influence of other patches cause an environmental difference between the interior of the patch and the edge. And this edge effect includes a distinctive species which is called ecotone We say when we move from a one plant community to another plant community, the marginal zone is called ecotone. It has got different type of the biodiversity, and it is comparatively richer as far as the number of species is considered. So similarly here also, when we talk about a patch, the edge areas they are ecotone areas, so they have distinct species composition, and that is more also. Then abrupt edges. Whenever there is no clear-cut edges of a patch, uh, when these are abrupt, they encourage parallel movement and they discourage lateral movement. So you can see here we have the human settlements towards one side, and this is the one where the boundary is defined. There is a stream, again the boundary is defined. So whenever the edges they are abrupt, then the movement will be parallel and not lateral. So that is also important. If there is convoluted edge, let's suppose the edge is like this. So convoluted edge, that will have more length. So it will contain more lobes and coves, and this will encourage movement through them. So they are going to move like this. They are not going to have a lateral movement. So their movement will be the one which is towards this side, the more towards the inner side the movement, and similarly towards the outer side. This is not forming a parallel pattern. Okay, so the movement is also not parallel. Then patch shape can be determined. If you want to find out the patch shape, it may be an irregular one. So if you need to find out its overall shape, then it is with the help of this formula where we have p upon 2 square root of pi a, where s, that is a patch shape. Then p, this is a perimeter of the patch. A is the area of the patch. So this is how you can determine shape of that patch. Then connectivity, this we have already studied, that corridors are the areas which provide connectivity between different patches. So they allow the movements of the organisms. They may serve as barriers also. So this is an example, a case study where the population movement was studied with and without corridors. So it is related to the butterfly movements. If the corridors were present, then we observed that the butterflies, they could easily move when the corridors were provided, but when the corridors were not there, so the movement was almost negligible. Then the ever-present influence of humans, that is also important. This cannot be ignored. It affects patch dynamics. So because humans, they are developing roads, power lines, railway lines, so they are creating corridors out of interest and as well as for their own consumption. So that is going to affect the size of the patch. So now coming to the overall concept of patch dynamics and its significance. Patch dynamics means a patch is changing, and we are studying, we are recording that, we are collecting that data. We are collecting for our study purpose, but naturally a patch is changing, it is under dynamics. Now this idea that we can study how the patch dynamic changes, that started in late 1940s when plant ecologists they study the structure and dynamics of vegetation in terms of interactive patches that it comprises. A mathematical theory that was developed for studying patch dynamics. It was by Simon Levin and Robert Penney in 1970s. They studied an intertidal community as a patch mosaic and various disturbances, how they changed the dynamics, tidal disturbances, that was studied. So on that criteria, a mathematical theory was proposed. And that is important. This study is important. Why this is relevant? Because this helps in conservation of the landscape. If we observe some activity is harming the overall dynamics of a patch and making it inactive, then the restoration activities, they can be started, they can be planned in that area, or a kind of the land use may be altered. So this is important for conservation of landscapes. So by understanding how a patch changes, this is a significance of studying patch dynamics. So by understanding how a patch changes and predicting how they will be affected by external forces like land use, restoration, succession, human activities, conservation strategies, all how they will change. Okay, so the fluctuations on the biggest patch, they can be used as an early warning of the biodiversity collapse. So if there is something like the species, they are getting extinct, so it can be considered as an alarming situation, and on that basis the restoration activities, they can be planned if the external conditions like climate change, habitat fragmentation change, they affect the dynamics of the patches. Let's suppose there is a sharp reduction in biodiversity, then it can be detected before it is actually produced, because we are conducting survey for the smaller areas and that can be interpolated for a larger landscape over the years. So this model can be proposed that okay, after 100 years or after 200 years, this will be the situation in this landscape. So accordingly, the alarming situation, it can be detected before it actually commences. Now, coming to the dynamics of land use, how a particular land is used, that is going to affect the biodiversity of that area. That is also going to affect the environmental conditions or overall dynamics of the patch. So, land use involves the management and modification of natural environment or wilderness into built environments like human settlements, industrial settlements, semi natural habitats like pastures, the croplands, managed forest areas, which are managed woods. So, this is how the land use can change. So, land use by humans has a long history. It's been more than 10,000 years ago when humans they started intervening with the natural habitats according to their own needs and requirements. Now, the total arrangements, activities, and inputs that people undertake in a certain land cover type, that is going to be decided as the land use. In 1990s, only 13% of the earth was considered arable land, with 26% of the pastures, 32% forest and woodland, and just 1.5% urban areas. But when we observe the recent data, then we see that the urban areas they are increasing, forest and the woodland is decreasing, pastures are also increasing, arable lands are also increasing. So you can see that overall change, land use has been changed rapidly, and there is deforestation also. So overall dynamics of the patches they are changing. Now the dynamics of land use and land cover over time is explained through, we have particular models for these which are called LCMs, that is land change models. What is the need of these land change models? Why it is required to study these models? Changes in land systems, they have consequences on climate also. It is not that we are just changing it for our need. That is ultimately linked to the overall conditions of that landscape. So it will affect the climate and the environment in that area. And in order to have a sustainable society and planet, whatever activity we are carrying out in a particular area, whatever land use we are putting in, that must be related to the consequences on the environment. Then land change models, they are significant in their ability to help guide the land systems to positive societal and environmental outcomes. That okay, when you have to plan a land use, then how it can be more sustainable, how it can be more environment friendly, that can also be clearly detected by using these LCMs. Then for the science community, land change models are important in their ability to test theories and concepts of land change and its connection to the human environment relationships. So as far as the ecological studies are involved, these LCMs they are very important because they can easily give you information that how the human intervention that has changed dynamics of a land. So that can be the theories on that basis can be proposed, and ultimately we can observe that later in life, after 100 years, after 200 years, the other generations they can observe that whether those theories put in well or not. Then land change modeling can account for complexity within dynamics of the land use and land cover by linking with climatic, ecological, biogeochemical, biogeophysical, and socio-economic models. So we can have a diversity of the models based on LCMs, which can have different zones of the study, and they can help in overall restoration of our earth. Now, what approaches are used for LCMs? One is machine learning and statistical modeling. So you can have a machine learning approach which will use the land cover data from past, and it will try to assess that how the land will change in future. You can have cellular models. In cellular models, a cellular land change model uses maps of suitability for various types of land use. Means you are going to give the information whether this land is suitable for this kind of activity or not. Okay. Then another is sector based and spatially disaggregated economical models. Economic models, they are built on the principles of demand and supply. As this is when you talk about commerce, for a particular model, for a particular land to be sustainable, it should be able to meet demand and supply both. So they use different mathematical parameters, different mathematical terms they are used in that, and they are used, models are proposed, and they predict what kind of land use that particular area can be used for, or they can also give you information whether let's suppose a particular area on those mathematical concepts that doesn't prove to be sustainable. In that case, the concept, whole of the concept, that can be discarded as well. So whether that model is economically sustainable or it is naturally sustainable, so that information can also be withdrawn. Then agent-based models. This is to simulate the behavior of many individuals making independent choices and then see how those choices affect the landscape. Like we have hundreds of the individuals, these which are selected in a particular area, then we are offered them with the questions. The questions are framed according to different theories or the ecological concepts, and on the basis of the choices which are taken up by the those individuals, the observations are made, and then how those choices means how they are going to use that land in future, that can give you an overall idea about the landscape as a whole. So that is called agent based models. So you are selecting models of observation. Then hybrid approach. In hybrid approach, when we combine all these first four approaches to some level, and we are using drawing information from any of these approach together, utilizing that in a combined effort to provide a more accurate model, then that is called an hybrid approach. Okay, now once you have prepared these land change models, these models, they should be evaluated. It is not that, okay, they are blindly followed. They must be evaluated first, that whether these are, they have predictive power, whether after many years they'll hold true, they'll stand true or not. So these models, they are evaluated to appraise and quantify the performance of a model's predictive power. Okay, whether the model will be is predictive enough for how many years, okay, for how much period it is. So the type of validation, that includes process validation, pattern validation. In process validation, compare the match between the process in the model and the process operating in the real world. So you are going to have two maps, one as it is happening in the real world, another as predicted by the model, whether they match or not. That is called process validation, and this is most commonly used in the agent-based modeling. Second is pattern validation. It compares model output, what is predicted through model, and the observed output. So here we prepare at a time three maps, they are prepared for this. One is the reference map at time 1 at a particular time. Another is a reference map, let's suppose after 15 years at time 2. Then you have a simulated map of time 2 which was given by the model. Okay, then you match them and then you come to the conclusion whether this model still holds good or not. So this is how you can say the fidelity of the model is actually checked, that is evaluated. Now, improvements of LCMS. The one improvement for land change modeling can be made through better data. So how you can have good LCMS, how it is possible. So you should have better data, a lot of observations should be there, real data should be there, and it should be integrated with whatever models are available. Okay. Then fine data can give you better idea of understanding rather than having a coarse data. So you should have fine-grained landscape information as compared to the coarse one. Then it is important to maintain the temporal and spatial continuity of data from airborne based and survey based observations. Like you can have different kind of the surveys, different kind of the observations, and through satellite coverage you can use different algorithms. That information can be taken up and put in use for preparation of LCMS. Then also you can have better models. LCMs, they can be improved by better alignment of model choices with the model goals, because it depends what kind of land use you want. So on the basis of that goal, the choices they can be made, and accordingly you can have better LCMS. Then it should also integrate optimization approaches. These are there whenever we propose model, we have this optimization approach so as to get maximum benefits from that model. It is important to better integrate data across scales. So you should have data on different scales, a smaller scale, a larger scale, so that, and that information should be integrated, then only you can have a good model. Then land change modeling can improve from better research infrastructure support. So if there are good facilities, good instrumentation, sophisticated instrumentation, analytical one, then it can result in good models. Then the land change modeling community can also benefit from global positioning system. GPS can be used, internet enabled mobile device data can be used. So we can take help from these different resources available so as to prepare a good model. So now coming to the overall broad aspect, what is the significance of studying landscape ecology? When we are studying so many aspects related to that, what should be the patch, what should be the scale selected, what should be the overall goals of land use, then what is the purpose of studying this? So that comes under the significance of landscape ecology. In modern times, the focus is shifting from restoration of small degraded patches to large landscapes. Now, we are not talking about small areas, we are talking about restoration of large landscapes. That is all because of this science landscape ecology. So, how this is helpful? First is it can provide you guidance for selecting reference sites. It can help you identifying the project goals and monitoring success. You can have different models on that basis. Time to time you can refer those and you can find whether you are able to achieve your objective or not. Then suggestions on various conservation strategies, they can be made as far as the global climate change is concerned. It can provide you information about the habitat fragmentation and how it is affecting the biodiversity conservation. It can also assess the natural spatial heterogeneity and whether that heterogeneity is getting affected by some activity or not, or how that can be improved or maintained. Then it promotes the development of models and theories of spatial relationships. So that can also be an aspect of landscape ecology. So this is the significance of landscape ecology, that overall the study is really very important when we are concerned about our environment and earth. So that's all with today's topic. Thank you.